Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Florian joins me and we're going to discuss some different web development related topics like Next.js. But before we kind of get to those things, Florian, could you maybe just give me a bit of your kind of tech journey so far?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel called Coding and Flow. This is where most people know me from. And I actually started coding pretty late in my life. I started 1 month before I turned 27. That was in 2017 then, I guess. No, I'm 33, sorry. And yeah, before that, I actually didn't study computer science. I didn't even have programming as a hobby. I completely started from zero at 26, basically. But since then, I've been doing it pretty much every day. So that's my journey. And yeah, I started my YouTube channel almost at the same time as when I started learning to code, just like maybe 2 months later or so. And I made videos about the stuff I learned throughout all this time. First in Android development, but about a year ago, I switched to web development with mainly React and Next.js. Yeah, that's the journey so far.
What kind of made you want to get into software and technology and stuff like that? Like, what was the kind of spark there?
Yeah, the spark was that I pretty much hated what I was doing before. After I studied business economics, but I didn't work in this field. Instead, I played online poker for a few years after university. And we made money with this stuff. I wouldn't recommend it anyone today anymore, but back then you could do this. And at a certain point, I hated it so much because it got really boring. It was basically just clicking buttons for, 8 or 10 hours per day. And once you know what you have to do against recreational players, there's not so much strategy involved anymore. It's more like automation. So it became really, really, really boring. And I already knew that I couldn't do this forever. I couldn't play poker for 30 years. For one, because it wouldn't be profitable, but also because it's not a career. It was just an intermediate thing. And then I took like a day or two where I really brainstormed what I want to do in the future. And I took everything into consideration and really tried to figure out what would I enjoy doing almost every day. And yeah, I remembered that I enjoyed coding as a kid. So I played around a bit with programming maybe at 12 or 13 years old. I did it for a while, but I didn't stick to it. I didn't stick to anything when I was that young. I didn't have enough discipline to stick with something. But I remember that I enjoyed it. And then maybe when I was 17 or 18, we had some programming classes in school, and I enjoyed this as well. And yeah, then at 26, I just remembered that I used to enjoy coding. Maybe I should give this a real try and try to learn this properly. And this is how I got to programming.
How did you go about kind of learning to code? Was it mostly through like watching YouTube videos, or did you go through a boot camp, or how did you kind of get into that?
That's a good question. I think the very first tutorial I tried was Codecademy back then, where they had some very basic tutorials where you could code directly in the web browser. I mean, it was cool to write the first few Hello World functions, but not much more. And then, I don't even know if I remember. I remember that I picked Android development because I saw that it was using Java, and Java was something that I already knew by name. I knew that I had installed Java on my PC, and I read that you can build games with it and mobile apps, and this seemed interesting to me, so I started with Android. But I don't really remember what I used to learn. I think I just used some beginner tutorial from Google. They had some decent beginner tutorials on Udacity, I think. Yeah, this was something I started with. And then I guess I just tried building little apps and learn in the process, which I think is the best way to learn programming anyway, just trying to build something. Yeah, so I just used some random beginner tutorials. I think it doesn't really matter for a beginner. There are many good beginner tutorials. Just pick one and use that and then try to build something.
And that's what I was going to follow up with, is how you would recommend like a beginner starting out, how should they kind of approach learning to code today? And it sounds like you kind of recommend finding some beginner tutorial, like there's a ton of them out there, start picking up the basics, and then from there, actually go try to build your kind of own stuff that you're actually interested in. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, right. Because it's the most fun way. When you try to build something that is interesting to you, then you have much more motivation than going through a list of stuff you have to learn. And it also works because, it's just a nice way to practice. And when you want to implement a feature, then you have to Google how to implement it. Then you will run into roadblocks. Then you Google how to get around these roadblocks. And this is just a process. And it works really well and teaches you a lot.
Yep, I definitely think that actually trying to build something is the way that kind of taught me the best, as you can kind of get stuck in watching tutorial after tutorial after tutorial. And if you never actually go try to build something, you never kind of hit those roadblocks and you never kind of piece things together and actually become like a kind of proficient developer in yourself.
Yeah, now that you say that, I remember that I also had a book, Head First Java, was one of the first books I read. And I did exactly this mistake. I read the book and I barely coded. I just studied the book basically, and I read about Java and interfaces and all of this stuff. But then when I tried to build something with it, I went completely blank. I couldn't do anything because it doesn't work this way. You always have to immediately apply the stuff you learn, otherwise it just doesn't stick.
Absolutely. And then you decided to kind of transition from, it sounds like you started with Android, and then from there, maybe you did some other things, but here recently in the last couple of years, it sounds like you transitioned into the Next.js and React world. Is there a particular reason that you kind of made that transition?
Yeah, I did Android for a long time, for like 4 or 5 years or so. And the reason I switched to web development was because I became interested in trying to build my own little startup, like indie hacking, where you build something without an investor, just by yourself.
Kind of bootstrapped.
Right. And there is just much more opportunity in this space with websites, with building websites. Because when you build a native Android app, then only Android users can use it, and that's it. But you can use a website pretty much anywhere, even on phones. And this is why I switched to web development. It's the only reason.
Gotcha. And then when switching to Next.js, did you follow a very similar approach to where maybe you read some beginner kind of fundamentals about Next.js and then just kind of start building your own project and figure it out? Or how did you kind of go about learning Next.js and kind of shifting towards kind of Next and React and the web development world?
Yeah, before I switched to a React, so I started with vanilla React, but before I switched to React, I already learned Jetpack Compose on Android, which is also a declarative UI framework, which works very similar to React. And so the transition was easy for me because it's very similar. The whole concept is the same. So I did, and also TypeScript, which I hadn't used before, is very similar to Kotlin, the language we use on Android these days. So I didn't even watch a beginner tutorial for TypeScript or React. I just started building stuff right away and Googled every problem along the way, and this was enough to learn it. And yeah, then I built some projects with it, and the little startup project I was building, I knew that it needed a blog for marketing. But the problem with vanilla React apps is that they are not great for search engines because JavaScript is used to render these pages. So the server or the crawler gets an empty page. That's the problem. It still works. Google can still index these pages, but apparently it's not as optimal as a server-side rendered page. And this is when people recommended me to try out Next.js. And then I migrated my whole page to Next.js, which was not very difficult because it's just a few additional APIs on top of React. And this is how I then switched to Next.js and learned it.
Gotcha. So since you already had experience with other kind of declarative frameworks as well as other typed languages. I'm guessing Kotlin is a typed language. I actually haven't ever used it, but since you're able to kind of move right to TypeScript, that background in those other languages, sounds like you're able to apply that pretty easily. And I think that a lot of beginners can kind of get caught up in, should I learn React? Should I learn Vue? Should I learn Angular? Should I learn, this other framework? But kind of as your experience shows here, if you learn one language or one framework, it's very easy to then apply that and pick up new languages, new frameworks pretty easily once you kind of get those fundamentals down.
Yeah, that's completely right. That's a trap people or beginners often fall into. They think when they study one thing, they have to start from zero when they learn another framework or another language. But often that's not the case. A lot of the programming knowledge just converts over to other platforms as well.
And when you started transitioning into kind of the React and Next.js world, is there any kind of mistakes that you kind of kept running into, or anything that you kind of felt was particularly tricky when kind of shifting over to these, or anything like that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think React is tricky in general because of the way it works with re-rendering and effects and state. But I think it's not worth studying JavaScript or vanilla JavaScript apps for a very long time just to avoid learning React, because it's a whole different approach. It's not vanilla JavaScript apps are more imperative and not this declarative approach. And actually, a lot of habits you might build in vanilla JavaScript apps are actually bad in React, because you don't want to write this imperative code where you write instructions on what exactly to do. You want to write this more declarative way how React works. So I do not recommend starting or spending a lot of time building vanilla JS apps. I think that's not worth it. So yes, there are a lot of mistakes that I did in React, but there is no way around doing them. I think you just have to do them, and then maybe you add breaks in certain situations. Maybe you get weird race conditions. Then you have to figure out why. Then you read some article that explains it to you, and then you fix it. So yeah, there is a lot of tricky stuff in React, but you don't get around making these mistakes. You have to make these mistakes.
And I think that one of the nice things about React is that it's been so popular for so long to where if you're making a mistake, 9 times out of 10, almost 10 times out of 10, someone else has made that mistake and has also wrote like a great article about how to solve that, that mistake that you're making. So I think it has that kind of community behind it that kind of makes it easy to like, all right, I'm running into these race conditions, or it looks like my component is just continuously re-rendering. What's kind of going on here? There's, definitely going to be an article or something on that kind of mistake that you're making.
Yeah, there's a ton of content around this. And ESLint is also pretty good in React to showing you some of the stuff. When you pass the wrong dependencies to a use effect or something like that. But yeah, there's an article about all of this, really good articles. React has a huge community of creators. It's crazy, much more than Android. There is almost nothing for Android. And yeah, but you find a solution to every problem in React.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is also something that beginners can sometimes not look into when they're starting to use a new technology. It's like, what is kind of the community support look like for this technology? So if I run into a problem, is there good documentation? Are there good articles about this? Has it been used by a lot of other people? And that's not to say you shouldn't ever use a technology that is kind of newer and doesn't have that good community behind it. But if you're trying to build like bootstrap a startup or something like that, something that you like want to be like this larger company or lifestyle company or whatever you want, it probably should be the core of that. Probably should be something that is a technology that is robust, might have a community around it, and kind of helps you kind of solve those mistakes that you kind of run into there.
Yeah, that's right. It's surprising that Android had or has such a small community of creators, considering that almost everyone has an Android phone in their pocket. But apparently not so many creators are interested in Android development. It's still a pretty small space. When I made my Android tutorials, my channel grew so fast. It was really surprising because there was this void that I filled. But yeah, unfortunately, web development is more fun, so I'd rather do this.
Yeah, and I think, for me, I like web development because it does cover so many bases as to where you can write code and then it can work on the web, of course, when you're at your computer. It can also work mobile on your phone, and then you can get into like progressive web apps and actually download your web application. So there's a lot of different things that you can do there. And I don't know, to me, it kind of feels like, we're going more and more towards the web side of things and less kind of native applications. But I would be interested, like, do you kind of feel the same way, or do you feel like, native applications for the phone still have like plenty of use cases and are still growing? Or how do you kind of feel when it compares to, web applications and building for the web versus building natively for someone's phone using, something for Android or something for the iPhone or something like that?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. It's all moving to web. I mean, these days we have crazy applications right in web browsers, video editors and stuff like that you don't even have to download anymore. It's crazy. I don't know if there's much left to do in native Android that you can. I mean, not as an entrepreneur at least. You can certainly work in a company on an existing large app. If that's what you want to do, there's probably enough opportunity for that. But I mean, there are some indie hackers on Twitter that I know about that still build native Android apps and native iOS apps, but most of them, I think, are switching to Flutter, so at least they cover both mobile platforms. But yeah, it all seems to move to the web. And I think even the Amazon Android app, for example, is just like a web viewer where they draw their website in or something like that. And I also had a podcast interview with a friend of me, and Don Felker, and it was 1 or 2 years ago, and he already said back then that everything is moving to web, and there's not much left for native mobile development, basically.
That's definitely the feeling that I get, that things are kind of moving towards, but I don't have a ton of experience with just solely building native applications. I've played around with React Native a bit, and actually I quite enjoyed it, and I like when you're able to use like native features of the phone, like the camera and different things like that. But it does seem like, more and more support for even that stuff is coming towards, the web and different things like that. So kind of with that, Florian, to kind of shift over a little bit, when you start a Next.js project or you have an idea for something that you want to build, what is your kind of process like for maybe designing that project? Do you like to just kind of like dive right into the code and just like, see what comes about? Or do you like to go to maybe something like Figma and draw out your pages and design it? Or what's kind of your process when you start a project?
Yeah, my projects are not big enough that I feel like I need to draw them in Figma in advance. I just start coding because it's not difficult to move a page to another, or to move a component to another page. So I always just start building. Only when I work on freelance projects, then I have some design in advance that I follow. But for my own projects, I don't really see the point. So I just start building, and for my tutorials as well.
And has that ever kind of come to bite you if you just start building and then you haven't done that kind of design up front? I know, like for me personally, I'm like you. I like to just dive into the code and figure things out as I go. But there are sometimes where I kind of architect my app in a way to where it's like, man, if I would have just thought about this a little bit more kind of upfront, it would have saved me a little bit of kind of refactoring kind of here as I go. But have you ever run into anything like that, or do you just still like to dive right into the code?
Yeah, the first real React and Next.js project that I built, which is still online, it's called tutab.io. It's like a search tool for programming tutorials. And it was one of the first real web dev projects I built. And today I don't really want to touch the code anymore because it's just complicated. But I think I wouldn't have been able to avoid this with preparing it in Figma, because it's more related to the code and the types that I'm passing around. So it's more a problem with the code quality and the different tools I'm using. And I don't think the code is terrible. I guess I'm just not very motivated to work on the project anymore. And these days I really like building the whole website with front end and back end directly in Next.js makes everything a bit easier than having a separate server.
Yep, I 100% agree with that. And when it comes to kind of the latest version of Next.js, I believe you have a video on maybe migrating from Next.js kind of page router to app router. Is there any kind of core differences between the two that you think that someone should really know about, or maybe even core features of the latest app router that you are important to understand, or that you really had to focus on learning once you were kind of making that shift? Or kind of how do you see those differences there?
Yeah, the Pages router and the new app router, they are quite different because the Pages router didn't use React server components. So, for a course I was making, I transferred a larger project from the Pages router to the app router. And even though the transition doesn't take that long, there's still a lot of paradigm shifts between these two ways of writing Next.js apps. They are quite different. So you just have to watch a new Next.js 13 app router tutorial to understand how this stuff works, because it's quite different. And the server components are a completely different thing to what we had before. But there's nothing specific I would point out between these two ways that comes to my mind.
For me personally, I would say kind of the biggest difference that I see is that transition to server components, and really having to have a better understanding of, okay, where is this component being rendered? What different JavaScript libraries can I use in this component? Because some certain JavaScript libraries are meant to be run in the browser and rendered in the browser and use different browser features, where others, you might be able to run them in a node environment or in a browser environment. And I think that kind of getting the grasp of that, and then also getting the grasp of where you can use React state and React context. And I can't tell you how many times I've tried to use useState. I go back to my browser and then I see you cannot use useState in a server component. Please use the useClient directive at the top of the file. I'm like, all right, come on. And kind of have to go do that. So I think that for me, it was kind of the biggest thing to get used to, of really trying to understand, okay, where do I have this component rendering, and understanding that by default, it's going to be rendered in a node environment, and you can't really use the useState, useClient, a lot of the different kind of React hooks and different things within that kind of environment there.
Yeah, that's right. But at least with this problem, you just get an error and it tells you what to do at useClient, and that's it. But what trips many people up is the way caching works, because there are different caches. That's quite complicated in the beginning, because there's a server-side cache and then the router has its own cache. Sometimes you don't get the latest version of a page. Then there are server actions, but they are still in alpha. Caching, and then request deduplication. That's also a weird topic, because now when you want to generate metadata for a page, depending on some data that this page fetches, then you have two separate functions. You have the component itself and then this generate metadata function. And you actually can't really share data between them. You can't pass data around between them. So you have to fetch the exact same data twice if you need it in both places. And the weird thing is that if you use the fetch function, the native fetch function, then it's automatically deduplicated. So you can just fetch the same data in both places. Next.js takes care of this. But if you use something like Axios or just an ORM like Prisma, for example, then you also have to fetch the data twice, but it's not deduplicated because it's not fetch, and Next.js doesn't intercept it. So then you have to use another function from React, which is just called cache, and wrap it into this cache function to deduplicate it yourself. This is definitely very confusing in the beginning. So yeah, caching is trickier. I had something else in mind, but I can't remember it right now.
The only other thing that I have in my mind is with kind of things defaulting to kind of server first, it does maybe remove some areas to where you might need to use like a request to your own backend and like use a route handler or something like that. Like you can just make a request straight from that server component to your database and not really have to worry about it. But other than that, I think that we kind of covered the kind of main differences between the app router and pages router, and kind of, for me, like moving to those server components is definitely a big one. But I like that you touched on caching and that deduplication, because that's also a big one. And I think caching in general can be really tricky when you're kind of just starting out, for sure.
Yeah, I just remembered the other thing I wanted to say. That's that even client components are pre-rendered on the server in Next.js. So that's a bit tricky to understand, I guess, because you have server components and you have client components, and you would expect that client components are rendered on the client, but they're still pre-rendered on the server and then hydrated on the client and blah, blah, blah. And so I think you still get problems if you use, for example, use state with an initializer in the client component. Then it can still complain that some APIs that a browser only has are not available on the server, because the initializer function of useState is also executed on the server. It's really weird. So you need this check if you are on the server or on the client by checking if the window object is undefined. So even in client components, you have to do some server checks. This is where I'm trying to get to.
Yep, I know I've definitely had to do that when kind of integrating some different libraries within my applications, having to kind of do some little stuff that kind of feels pretty hacky, to where it's like, all right, does the window object exist? If not, do this, and then kind of having to do those manual checks. I think that, some of that is probably going to get worked out as, the app router is, more and more focused on, and a lot more people use it, and there's more kind of package support for it and stuff. But I think right now you might have to do some of that kind of hacky stuff.
Yeah, right.
Perfect. Well, let's kind of end here with maybe a few different kind of rapid fire questions. So in maybe less than 2 or 3 sentences, let's see some answers to these questions here. So number 1, what is your preferred tech stack? And I think that we already kind of covered this a little bit, but what's your answer here?
Yeah, obviously Next.js, full stack these days, so front end and back end. And I like to use, I'm already at 2 sentences probably. Or let me say like this: Next.js, full stack with server actions, hosted on Brazil, and some database depending on which one you prefer.
And for styling?
Tailwind with Shatsy and UI right now.
Awesome. And then will artificial intelligence take all of our developer jobs?
Yeah, I think the truth is that nobody knows. Nobody can say this at the moment. Everyone is just guessing.
I 100% agree with that. What's one technology you're kind of most excited about, or maybe a technology that you really want to focus on learning or something like that?
Everything about AI, especially language processing at the moment, because it already improves my developer experience and my life quality already with the stuff we have available now. So I really like this stuff.
100%. I particularly think when it comes to styling my application, I will literally take my React components, paste that into ChatGPT and say, hey, make this look really good in dark mode, and it will just generate the component in like 3 seconds, and I don't have to worry about it, which I absolutely love. So
it's amazing.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to kind of focus on and also be excited about. And then as a final question here, what do you think is the best way for someone to kind of level up or to excel in their kind of development career?
I think by making sure that programming is something they enjoy at least half of the time. And if you are in your early 20s and you're doing something that you don't enjoy, like I did, then don't be afraid to switch. But I don't really have a programming career. I have my channel and freelance stuff, but I'm not working in a large company, so I can't really give advice about that. But yeah, just make sure that you enjoy it, and then you will spend enough time practicing it that you will become good, I think.
I would still say that you have a programming career, but maybe just not so like necessarily a programming job to where you work for a company and stuff like that. Like definitely still working in the space and doing a heck of a job doing it. But just kind of doing your own thing, which honestly for a lot of people is kind of the dream. But thank you so much for coming on today, Florian. I definitely really enjoyed it and really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me.